going to go ahead and get it started. Thank you very much for being here with us this morning, folks. Actually, it's not the morning anymore. It is where our speaker is coming from in Washington State. But thank you so much. This is such an important topic and such an important program. We are here because of this youth marijuana prevention project that we've been a part of for the last 4 years now. We're entering our 5th year of this grant from the Montgomery County Office of Drug and Alcohol. I see that Katie is on with us. Katie Cush, would you like to say hello and share any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Hi, everyone. Katie Cush. I'm serve as a prevention coordinator for Montgomery County's Department of Health and Human Services. Very much appreciate you all spending part of your afternoon on a Friday with us to learn about this important topic. And we hope to stay connected with you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Katie. We have a lot of other aspects to this program that we want you to learn more about. So my colleagues are on with us, Judy Hirsch and Bob Lamb, and they're going to be sharing some links in the chat that will take you to our follow-up page for today's program. But also we have this, as I said, the Youth Marijuana Prevention Project. So there are a lot of resources that are connected with that as well. We hope that you'll feel free to submit your questions at any time. The recording is going to be posted on our follow-up page, but that recording will not have any of your questions visible or anything like that. So you're welcome to do that. And after Dr. Schauer gives her presentation, we'll be sure to address as many of those questions as we can. At the end of the program, we would love for you to take a survey that gives us some feedback. Now, normally it pops up at the end. This is not a webinar. This is a meeting style. So we'll be sharing that link for the survey as we get near the end of the program. So it's also going to be on that follow-up page that I mentioned right here on conversation.zone/lead. So we really love to hear from you to let us know if this was helpful. Also, some thoughts that you might have about other topics you would like to hear about in the future. Just a word about be a part of the conversation. If this is your first time with us, just want you to know that we've been around for just about 12 years now. We present a lot of community events. We're typically out there in the evenings, making it a little bit more accessible to the general public, but our topics really vary from prevention to intervention to crisis management and supporting ongoing recovery. And we focus a lot on families. So a lot of our audience, our family members, who are impacted by a substance use disorder. Like myself, I'm the parent of someone in recovery. And we have these parent partnership meetings that take place throughout the year, every week of the year, 5 days of the week. There are 18 meetings every week. Those can be found on our website as well. And the family recovery course is only about a year or so old, a little over a year old. It's a 3-part course for family members who've been impacted by some substance use disorder. There's no charge to attend any of these things that you see here. Thanks to our partners like Montgomery County and some others in our region here in southeastern Pennsylvania. We have a website with a lot of information on it. So I hope you'll visit that and explore and see if there's some way that we can support you. We have the calendar of events where you can find out some of the programs that we have coming up. And we have a YouTube channel, which is where this program will be recorded and posted. But we have a lot of content on there as well. So I hope you'll visit that. I'm going to get to our presenter now. And Dr. Schauer was elected CANNRA's first executive director in 2021. And she served as the senior advisor. CANNRA, by the way, is the Cannabis Regulators Association. She served as their senior advisor before they received their funding. She has worked in public health and policy for nearly 2 decades. She has a decade of experience working with federal and state agencies on cannabis policy, data monitoring, and research translation. Through her federal work, she founded and led the Multi-State Collaborative for Cannabis and Public Health from 2014 to 2021 to foster learnings and cultivate best practices for public health across states with legal cannabis. Prior to working on cannabis policy, Dr. Schauer worked on tobacco control policy. She was the senior editor of the 2020 Surgeon General's report on smoking cessation. She's an affiliate researcher at the University of Washington and has more than 65 peer-reviewed research publications on cannabis and other substances. She has her PhD from Emory University, a Master of Public Health from the University of Washington, and a Bachelor of Science from Northwestern University. So thank you so much, Dr. Schauer.
Thank you so much for having me, Kim, and thanks to everybody in the audience for the work you guys do in the field. I know this work can be hard at times, and you probably don't hear often enough that it's needed and appreciated. So thanks for having me. I'm happy to be back again. Last year, I spoke with you all about a lot of the youth data and prevention data. This year, I am coming back to talk more about sort of regulatory updates. So I think my presentation from last year and the presentation you're going to hear today will work nicely together. Just a reminder, I don't have any external funding sources to disclose. I don't take funding from pharma, alcohol, tobacco, or cannabis. And I'm going to present a lot of things that are my own opinion and don't necessarily represent an official position of the Cannabis Regulators Association or of any of our member states and territories. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the Cannabis Regulators Association. Pennsylvania is a member. I think last year when I spoke with you all, Pennsylvania was not. So I want to share with you a little bit about what we do. Your regulator and regulatory agency are members. I want to talk about the policy context that we're in now for cannabis, give some updates there. And then I'm really going to talk about 3 or 4 sort of segments of updates. I'm going to talk about challenges to consumer safety and regulation. I'm going to talk a lot about hemp-derived cannabinoid products. I've been working on this issue for 2 years. I think it's one of the biggest threats we have to youth prevention and consumer safety right now. I'm going to talk briefly about interstate commerce. And as always, everything needs to be underscored with an equity and social justice lens. And I'll talk about where we are with those things today. So CANNRA, we are a nonpartisan association. We exist to convene, educate, and support government agencies that are engaged in cannabis regulation or policy implementation. We have 44 states and territories, and I'll show you the map of our members across the US. And we also have some members that don't yet regulate cannabis, but have joined to be part of the conversation and to sort of learn from each other. We work through our members. We are member funded. We don't have any non-governmental members, and our members staff our board and our committees. And we have a dozen different committees focused on all aspects of cannabis policy. I think there's a lot of value in bringing regulators together to learn from each other, especially as we are lacking the normal federal guidance that would come in this space. So that's the area that we occupy. Just this year, we opened our membership up internationally, and we will be bringing on a couple international governments as well. So you saw the map of CANNRA members. It's very similar to the map of cannabis policy. And we've had some recent changes with Maryland and Delaware recently legalizing. The dark green are the states that have legal adult and medical use. There are 22 of those states and DC now. The kind of medium color green are the states that have comprehensive medical cannabis programs. And then the light green are states that really don't have a regulator at the helm, but have given some approval for low THC or CBD products apart from hemp. And there are 3 states, Idaho, Nebraska, and Kansas, that really don't have access to anything at this point. So this has been a continually increasing trend that we've seen this map get greener and greener as time has gone on. Before I talk about the topics I want to talk about today, I always like to talk about terminology. So we do still talk about medical and recreational states, but increasingly, I think the line is really blurred. There are some states that have medical programs that we know have policy approaches that might be more recreationally focused in nature, and there may be consumers in that marketplace that are not consuming only for medical reasons. Similarly, I don't like to use the term recreational because I think it connotates fun or enjoyment, and it's not really a descriptor of all of the recreational programs. So I use the term adult use. My home state of Washington is a great example. We have one marketplace in Washington. There's not a separate medical marketplace. There's not a separate recreational marketplace. It's one marketplace for adults, and patients use that marketplace as well as adults that might be consuming cannabis for recreational reasons. So I think adult use is the better term to use here for a lot of reasons. I also typically would have said I'm going to use cannabis throughout the presentation. Marijuana as a term has some underlying racial history that is not positive. However, with the legalization of hemp, I think there is still a need sometimes to say, I'm talking about marijuana here, or I'm talking about hemp here. So just want to raise that I'm sensitive to the racial undertones of the term marijuana. I will use cannabis most of the time, but when I talk about hemp, you might hear me say marijuana to really distinguish between the two. Both hemp and marijuana come from the cannabis plant, so they are both cannabis. So there's some confusion in terminology. I hope that clears up a little bit. So this is the timeline that we've seen for adult use legalization. I think I showed this last year when I presented as well. You can see early on legalization was happening through ballot measures. And those ballot measures yielded some legislation to set up the regulatory framework, but the regulators were often given broad authority through ballot measures. Now we've really seen a turn where the majority of legalization is coming legislatively. And that has also meant that regulators tend to have less authority given to them than they did before. The legislation that's passing is often very prescriptive, and it's lawmakers at the state level that are deciding things like, what does testing look like? What does packaging and labeling look like? There can be challenges in that because these are very technical areas that need to change as the market evolves and changes. And so it's not uncommon to have even veteran states like Washington and Colorado have more than a dozen different measures or bills come up in legislative session, even 10 years into legalization. And I'll talk a little bit about where I think the legislative approach, can pose some challenges. So what do regulated cannabis markets look like? In Pennsylvania, you all have a medical marketplace, but in case you haven't visited a state that has an adult use marketplace, regulation happens through departments of health, revenue, consumer protection, alcohol and beverage control boards, or increasingly in adult use states through standalone regulatory agencies. So we do see a trend where medical programs tend to be housed in the Department of Public Health. And then as adult use comes on, they tend to become a standalone regulatory agency. One of the positive trends I see, though, is that many of those standalone regulatory agencies are bringing in public health people, they are bringing in scientists, they are bringing in the experts that they need, but that can be a shift to move it from public health to a more regulatory focused agency. Regulated markets license entities that grow, process, and sell cannabis. And for adult use, there are adult-only retail stores that sell cannabis and cannabis products. If we think about other substances like tobacco or alcohol, to me, personally, this is a huge plus on the policy side for cannabis, that every state so far has decided to have adult-only retail stores that can only sell cannabis. I mean, you can imagine how different alcohol and tobacco public health issues would be if they were only sold in adult-only stores. So I think that's an important policy angle when we think about youth prevention, and one that I hope is upheld personally. Again, not a CANNRA opinion, that's my personal opinion. Regulations in marketplaces are being set for product safety, for ingredients, for product testing. I'm going to talk about those briefly. For packaging and labeling, for advertising, for what the point of sale environment looks like. Inspections and compliance checks are something that are part of all adult use marketplaces as well. Public education and stakeholder engagement is also a big focus for regulatory agencies, as is, and I'm really happy to share this, as is data monitoring. I think in the early days, there wasn't as much of a focus on collecting data to understand the impacts of policy. And increasingly, cannabis regulatory agencies are hiring in data analysts and data viz folks that can really make sense of the data and help the regulatory agency and lawmakers understand what does the policy look like when it's been implemented. That said, as I mentioned, there are these frequent changes to policies and procedures, even in established states. The guiding principles for almost every cannabis regulatory agency I have worked with tend to hover around the 5 things that are on the screen. And some regulatory agencies may have a higher priority for one of these than another, but generally we see regulators trying to uphold consumer safety, trying to protect public health and safety, trying to promote equity or diversity in the market, and that can mean different things in different states. Regulators, though, are also looking for market stability and for economic growth. So coming from a traditional public health or prevention lens, that might be surprising to hear, but that is a traditional role that regulators tend to play. You don't want to regulate so that the market vanishes. That's usually not a goal. The goal is that you regulate in a way that you're protecting, these top two items, that you're promoting diversity, but that you're also creating some stability in the market. So cannabis legalization now, I think we're really in what I would say is version 2.0 or 3.0. In the early days of legalization, when Colorado and Washington legalized, if you recall, there was a memo that the DOJ put out called the Cole Memo. The Cole Memo basically said the federal Department of Justice is not going to challenge these legalization experiments, provided that you adhere to this list of things. And included in that list were things like preventing access to youth, preventing criminal activity or drug trafficking, promoting public health and safety. Those were the kind of tenets in the Cole Memo. That memo has since been rescinded. It was rescinded under the Trump administration, and it was not replaced by anything. So I think we're in a different era, in part because that memo isn't there, but also in part because so many states have now legalized that I think the threat of the federal agencies coming in and shutting things down is not there in the same way. And so that has really freed up policymakers and regulators to think about how can we do this best, as opposed to thinking about how can we do this so that the federal government doesn't shut everything down. And with that, we've learned a lot in the last decade. So we have learned, I think in the early days in Washington and Colorado, voters were legalizing in large part because of social justice reasons and the war on drugs. They were legalizing because they did not want to see particular communities bear the brunt of the criminalization of certain drugs. Now, we have learned in 10 years that legalizing cannabis is insufficient to repair the social justice harms that have happened. Legalization of cannabis has to be done in a very specific way with a focus on social equity and social justice to help remedy some of the harms that have happened. And so I think that's been a big shift for folks. Another big shift has been this focus on public health and consumer safety. I think in the early days, the regulators would openly tell you they were not focused on consumer safety and public health in the same way. They were really focused on how do you stand up this industry? Where do we need checks and balances? But in the wake of the vaping lung injury outbreak, every single regulator in the country has taken a much more careful look at how to protect consumer safety, what is going into products, where does testing need to go, where are the shortcomings, and I'll talk about some of that. And then also, I think increasingly, there's going to be more parity or fluidity between the different regulatory pathways. So I will talk about hemp again in detail, but I think traditionally some states said, we've got medical legalization over here and adult use legalization over here. The programs may have looked very different. And I think they realized that for consumers, that differentiation wasn't there. And you were getting adult use consumers using the medical space, medical consumers using the adult space, and there are things that need to be similar across policies in both different programs. So I'm often asked, what's the difference between cannabis and tobacco, alcohol, or opioids? Or isn't cannabis just like tobacco? Shouldn't we be leveraging all of those policy learnings? And my answer is always that I think there are important overlaps, but I think there are also substantial differences. And I think cannabis is its own unique substance and warrants some unique approaches. So I'll go through this briefly. I could probably give a whole presentation on this, and that's not what I have planned, but I think it's important to cover. So when we look at commercial tobacco, and I'm not talking about sacred tobacco, I'm talking very specifically about commercial tobacco, we do see some similarities in the populations that consume cannabis and consume commercial tobacco. We see a lot of similarities in the modalities of consumption. You can smoke or vape cannabis products just as you can smoke or vape commercial tobacco products. Increasingly, we see some similarities in the industry and industry overlap. We see tobacco companies becoming much more invested in cannabis companies and cannabis products and cannabis brands. And then we see some policy overlap, especially when we're talking about things like clean indoor air policies. And I'm happy to talk about any more of these in the Q&A. But we see some huge differences. I don't think anybody would say that there's accepted medical uses for commercial tobacco. And the bottom line with cannabis is there is legitimate science to suggest that there is medical use for cannabis and cannabinoids. So that's a big difference. Commercial tobacco is not impairing or intoxicating in the way that cannabis is. The addiction potential so far for tobacco products is much greater than cannabis, as is the morbidity and mortality. So some big differences. A lot of states have legalized under the guise of regulate cannabis like alcohol. So what are the similarities and differences there? Alcohol has also followed this sort of prohibition to legality framework. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that. There is certainly some policy overlap that could be gleaned. The industries, again, like tobacco, are overlapping, and we see big alcohol companies investing in cannabis companies, investing in cannabis products. The cannabis beverage area is extremely popular right now and is growing, and many of the alcohol companies are interested in that and or watching that space carefully. Alcohol is impairing and intoxicating, similar to cannabis, and so a lot of what we have focused on in a policy realm for an impairing substance might be similar. And the addiction potential for alcohol is also similar, around 10%. Not to say that dependence doesn't happen, it absolutely does, but it's much lower than, say, for tobacco. Big differences: you cannot smoke or vape alcohol, and the morbidity and mortality from alcohol is still much greater. Opioids, some similarities. Both opioids and cannabis have these legitimate medical uses. Both are produced by our bodies and bind to systems in our bodies. So the endocannabinoid system exists in all of us. And the endocannabinoid system is something that our body is producing natural components that bind to that. So that's a similarity that could be looked at. Opioids are also impairing, and opioids also have this commercial industry that's much like cannabis. Differences: the really negative effects that we all know about from opioids are respiratory depression. So that's what is resulting in death. That's when, it's impacting the lungs and people are not able to breathe. Even though the endocannabinoid system has CB1 and 2 receptors, they're really not pervasive in the lungs. And so respiratory depression is not a side effect that we've tended to see from cannabis products. That's not to say that we wouldn't see a product someday that might have that, but it's not been a side effect we've seen. The addiction potential for opioids is much greater, as is the morbidity and mortality. So I think there are things to be gleaned from all of these other areas, but I think cannabis is substantially different in some important ways too. So let's talk about consumer safety and the challenges there. Lab testing is one of the important policy things to come out of the way that states have regulated cannabis. However, it's not without challenges. So part of the challenge is that every single state has had to create their own lab testing scheme. Usually this is something where we would have FDA and EPA heavily involved in setting minimum standards, in working carefully with state regulators, and FDA and EPA are not involved. So this means that every state has had to create their own approach, has had to figure out what are the tests they're going to be conducting, what are the thresholds for those tests, what do you do with the results from those tests. And because cannabis is a Schedule I substance federally, the lab system that every state has had to set up relies on third-party labs. So those are labs that are their own companies. Most of them, many of them are for-profit companies, and they have as their clients the industry. And so it can be challenging in some areas to have veracity in testing results, because the lab wants to provide, in many cases, the industry with the result that they want to see. That's been challenging for states, and what in an ideal world would be a check and balance on that is something called a reference lab. So that would be a state-run lab or a state contracted lab that would focus on being a check and balance on those third-party labs. That state-run reference lab would be able to say, we're going to check your test to see if we got the same thing. We're going to check your proficiency to make sure you can run the test in the right way. There are a lot of important needs that a state regulator has to have access to a lab. And there are many states where they just don't have access to a state-run lab because state-run labs take federal funds, and they often don't want to engage in testing cannabis because they're worried about their federal funds. So the lab structure has been a challenge for states. Sampling and process validation varies across states. The way that states get samples from these third-party labs, there's still a number of states where the entity that is being tested, the licensee, is the one saying, here's our sample. So they could certainly choose a sample that might have a certain result. There are lots of questions around what we should be testing for, what additives should be tested for, what individual cannabinoids should be tested for. Every single cannabis product has to have its own method for testing and has to have thresholds for that method. That can be a challenge as well. And then I think the big public health question for states is, what do you do with the test results? When do you decide that something is a concern to public health and safety, and when is it not? And again, that's an area where normally FDA and EPA would be involved. So as you guys have probably been aware of, I think there have been some cases in your own state of Pennsylvania. There are these issues with lab shopping, where licensees are going to find the lab that they think will give them the highest THC test, or will falsify testing so that they pass testing. These are very real challenges that we as a group of regulators talk about all the time and try to figure out what can be done to make sure that consumers know the product has been tested and is safe. There's also a lot of question around additives, especially in the wake of the vaping lung injury outbreak. So to remind you all, and I suspect you all were working in this field during the vaping lung injury outbreak, but in case you weren't, it was lung injury that caused deaths and hospitalizations across all states, and was the result of mostly illicit THC products, but it was not the THC that caused the lung injury. It was the addition of vitamin E acetate as an additive or something to sort of dilute the THC resin. And so vitamin E acetate has been basically taken off the market and is something that states are testing for and are aware of. But there are lots of additives that are used in cannabis. Cannabis and THC in particular, it's not like nicotine. It's not water soluble, it's fat soluble. And that means the additives that are used for cannabis are unlike additives that we have seen in the nicotine space. So every state has had to try to figure out, what additives do we think are harmful? What additives do we think are okay? Where are we going to draw the line? And we see states having some different policies here. There's also not a lot known about terpenes. So terpenes are the flavoring components of the cannabinoid plant. They are inherent to the plant. They can be derived botanically from other plant matter and added back in, but the terpene profile in the cannabis plant is a very real thing. So, I've had discussions with folks about the fact that we're getting rid of flavors in tobacco, but flavors are prevailing in cannabis products. How do you square that? My personal answer there is, I think a lot has to do with branding and marketing and how you talk about the flavors, but more similar to wine, you can't have cannabis without having some of these naturally occurring flavors. So we have a lot more to understand about what those flavors do in the body, about what it means when they're extracted from the plant and added back in. We have states that have all different policies here. Some states have no policies having to do with terpenes. Other states have said, hey, we don't want more than 10% of your product to be terpenes because the plant doesn't have more than 10% terpenes, and we don't want to have, say, a vape cartridge that's 60% terpenes when we don't understand the effects of that in the body. But generally, these kind of additives are not highly regulated by cannabis regulators, and part of that is because we just don't have the science. There are some policy levers that states are using, thresholds for additives, like I talked about the 10%, requiring entities to fully disclose the ingredients that they are using, requiring them to disclose if those ingredients came from the cannabis plant or came from something else or are synthetic, and then borrowing from some less than perfect FDA approaches that were not designed for cannabis. That's why I would say they're less than perfect. GRAS requirements for food, an inactive ingredient list that's required for drugs. Those are not perfectly applied for cannabis, but states are leveraging that to be able to use something. Other approaches that states take for consumer safety: pre-market oversight and compliance. So all adult use states are requiring testing. Many are requiring product pre-approval, where they actually look at the product and the ingredients before they approve it to decide if they think it's safe or not. Packaging review to make sure that the product doesn't appeal to youth. And then a track and trace system that allows them to literally track the plant from a seed all the way until components of that plant are in products. There's also post-market oversight that happens, but there's still a lot that's needed in this consumer safety and lab testing space. We need more highly validated methods. We need training to ensure that labs are using those appropriately. We need regulatory staff that have that lab microbiology and chemistry background. We need the access of state labs to be helping. We need state reference labs. And then we really need more science on these additives and constituents. So closing out the consumer safety piece, but I think this is tangentially related, I'm going to talk for a bit of time about hemp and the federal legalization of hemp, which I think is one of the biggest challenges to consumer safety and youth prevention that we have in front of us today. If there was to be another EVALI-like event, I would strongly suspect hemp-derived products just because they are basically federally unregulated. So we are seeing all the same products on the hemp market as we are seeing on medical and adult use cannabis markets. And in fact, I think we're probably seeing more on the hemp market because it's not regulated at the federal level. This didn't used to be the case. I think the hemp market started with a toe in the water, with edibles, with maybe some smokables, but now we even see dabs. So this down here in the left-hand corner, this is a product that I'm going to talk about youth access, but you could order this online without having to do much more than check that you're over 21 and have a credit card. And this product is a highly concentrated Delta-8 dab. And not only that, but it actually tells you what's a dab and shows you how you might consume the dab. So I think we're reaching a point where this is a huge challenge to the regulated markets that have been set up because these products are so pervasive. So why is this happening? The 2018 Farm Bill had a change to the language around hemp that basically created federal legalization of hemp. It's scientific, but I'm going to read it because it's important. The definition of hemp that was put in the 2018 Farm Bill was extremely broad and basically legalized the plant species Cannabis sativa L, which is the same plant that produces marijuana, and any part of that plant, including the seeds, all derivatives, extracts, cannabinoids, isomers, acids, salts, and salts of isomers, whether growing or not. And then it set the line in the sand just around Delta-9 THC. And it set it on a dry weight basis, so by weight, with not more than 3.3% on a weight basis. So a weight basis is often used in agriculture. And in a plant, 0.3% by weight is not a ton of Delta-9 THC. But in a chocolate bar or a beverage or something that weighs a lot more, you can pack a lot of THC into that. I'll talk more about that. So this broad definition really opened up basically anything that comes from the hemp plant as being legal. The DEA was asked to clarify how broad do you think this definition really is? And they clarified that all synthetically derived THCs would remain Schedule I controlled substances, but they did not define synthetically derived. And there are chemists all over the country that can argue on either side of this issue that what we're seeing on the market is synthetic and what we're seeing on the market is not synthetic because it is something that came from the plant. So that did not help a lot to have that DEA clarification without them defining synthetically derived. There have also been some court challenges related to Delta-8 and some of the other compounds that are coming out from hemp. And the court has read the language in a very literal way from the Farm Bill and has basically said, regardless of the wisdom of legalizing Delta-8 products, the court will not substitute its own policy judgment for that of Congress. So that's how we got into the situation. The Cannabis Regulators Association just put a letter out last week that we'll make sure you get a link to, but we talked in the letter to Congress about the three main loopholes through which these products are coming about. So I've talked briefly about the derivatives loophole. So that is the chemical derivation of different cannabinoids using CBD. So the basic process for that is you take the hemp plant, you extract the CBD, and I think that's kind of where people thought it might end. But you can take that CBD into a lab and you can use acid, heat, and solvents, and you can make a lot of other cannabinoids, some of which are found in nature and some of which are not. So here's a list of just some of the cannabinoids that are out there. And I feel like every couple weeks I hear about a new one from the regulators that I work with. So that's one of the loopholes, this derivatives loophole. Another loophole is the THCA loophole. So THCA is the precursor to delta-9 THC, and THCA abounds in the cannabis plant, whether it's hemp or whether it's cannabis. You're not likely to find a ton of delta-9 THC in the cannabis plant itself. What you're likely to find is THCA. And that's the very reason why every single medical and adult use program in this state has a broad definition for THC that includes THCA and delta-9 THC. So if you were to eat just a plant off the, a bud off the plant in the field and it had mostly THCA, you would not get high. THCA does not get you high alone. But as soon as you heat it or combust it or smoke it, that acid molecule on the THC drops off and it becomes delta-9 THC. So what's happening now is many states are reporting that hemp sellers are selling flower, bud, that has 25% THCA that is Farm Bill compliant. That is effectively selling a flower that has 25% delta-9 THC, which is indistinguishable from the kind of products that you would find in a medical or adult use store. So that's another important loophole. And the Farm Bill didn't mention THCA at all. So it is one of those, one of those components from the hemp plant that folks might argue is legal. The last loophole that's being used is the 0.3% loophole. So I talked about the 0.3% threshold is by weight. And as soon as you get a chocolate bar or a beverage or any sort of food product, 0.3% of that weight can be hundreds of milligrams of THC. And many states have reported that they routinely see hemp products that have more legal delta-9 THC in them than is allowed in their medical or adult use market. Most adult use states have a 5 milligram or a 10 milligram serving size with a max of 50 milligrams or 100 milligrams of delta-9 THC per package. What we're seeing on the hemp landscape is products that can have 200, 300 milligrams of THC in them and still meet this 0.3% threshold. So those are the loopholes through which we are seeing the variety of products that we're seeing. I think there are a number of different concerns that are in play here that have presented challenge for communities and regulators and public health. There are consumer safety concerns. There's inadequate labeling on final products. So consumers, and I've had family members do this, go to the grocery store and accidentally buy something that has hemp in it and they have no idea what's in it. I know people who've bought things that have CBD in them and they don't have any idea whether or not there's THC in that product or not, and there may well be. And people, I think, generally assume that hemp products are not going to be intoxicating. And so there can be a real risk of accidental consumption or accidental overconsumption from these products. There's no federal requirement that entities list the number of milligrams of THC or even that the product contains THC. There are no required warnings federally. There's no required serving size or package limits. Generally, I think consumers aren't aware of what these products might contain. And increasingly, some online marketplaces like Amazon are saying, we don't even want you to list a cannabinoid. If you want to sell something on our site, you have to say that it's hemp. So you can go on Amazon and you can find products with 1,000 milligrams of hemp that you can order from Amazon. Well, what is hemp? Is that CBD? Is that THC? Is that something that could get you high? Is that something that would be of a concern for a child or young adult to access? I think all of these are very real consumer safety questions. The next area is that these products, because they are not well regulated at the federal level, they're generally not subjected to the same testing requirements. So I talked about a lot of problems on the testing side for cannabis, but testing is happening and every product is being tested or linked back to some test. For hemp, that is not a requirement. The only federal requirement is that they test it in the field to know that it meets the definition of hemp. There are some new cannabinoids coming out, Delta 10, Delta 8, HHC, THCO, where we literally have no data from use in humans. We have no idea what it does in the body and what thresholds might be concerning. The manufacturing process that I talked about, the chemical manufacturing, can leave unidentified byproducts, which would be very concerning to know that people are vaping, can leave, other contaminants that are not being tested and extracted out. So the testing is a real risk. And we're seeing now scientific research 2 or 3 years into this that's really underscoring the importance of that. So the study on the left, basically tested a bunch of products to see were there these unidentified byproducts and heavy metals. And yes, they all had them present. The study on the right, vaping cannabinoid acetates leads to ketene formation. This group looked at THCO acetate and looked at what happens when you vape it, and found that the acetate molecule in THCO acetate forms ketene gas, which is a poisonous gas, which nobody should be consuming. So lots of concerning science starting to emerge around the constituents of these products as well. These are widely available in retail outlets and widely available to youth. I think it's interesting that a lot of legislative discussion in the last 2 sessions has focused on high concentration THC products and all these things in the regulated market that folks are concerned about, but nobody talks about the hemp market. And I think that's where kids have the most access to these types of products. These are available in grocery stores, gas stations, coffee shops. Because they don't have packaging requirements, they have cartoons. They can really appeal to kids in the way that they market. This is a very real site. I don't know if it's still up. As of a few months ago, it was Nerd Ropes. You can buy this product online, and all you have to do is have a credit card. It doesn't tell you exactly what's in it, but has a couple 100 milligrams of THC and looks exactly like candy that a kid might purchase. So very concerning. I'm sorry, hang on one second. I'm sorry, half my family got COVID this morning. And so and we've not had it. So I'm at home with a 4-year-old that has COVID and trying to help him navigate. Apologies. So these products are widely available online. They have no or limited age gating, and it really is blurring the line between even what's hemp and what's the illicit market. So huge youth access issue. We've seen, because of all of what I just discussed, we've seen an increase in poison center reports about these products. The CDC released in 2021 a health I'm sorry. The CDC released a health advisory notice about some of these effects, and they've since updated those data. So this was the notice from 2021. I'm not going to go through it because there's newer data now that go through 2022. These would only be the cases that were reported to poison centers, which is certainly going to be an underestimate, because that would mean that somebody would have to have made the call to the poison center, that they would have to have known that they consumed a product that they could report to the poison center, and that they would have followed up to share what happened. So there were a couple thousand exposures. 41% were pediatric patients under 18, 40% were unintentional exposures, and 82% of those unintentional exposures were in pediatric patients. 70% of cases required healthcare facility evaluation. 8% of those resulted in admission to critical care. And at least one case was coded with an outcome of death. So certainly we're seeing the sentinel data from poison centers suggest that this is indeed a challenge. The FDA has generally not done a lot in this space. They have released some guidance and warning letters. They have started to collect data to try to be helpful in understanding what's going on, but they've not taken any regulatory approach here to help states. This is an issue that really has been left to states to handle. And I think state regulators are struggling because they don't all have the authority to address the issues that are happening with these products. In many states, the regulator only has authority to address cannabis products. They don't have authority for the products that are coming under hemp. And this also can undermine adult use markets that I think regulators and policymakers are trying to craft with a lens towards consumer safety and youth prevention. So when we look at licit, or legal markets versus illegal markets, I think there are some important things. Whatever your perspective is on cannabis legalization, people are using cannabis, and now people are using hemp products as well. one of the things that legal markets are trying to do is, again, test and regulate these products, have them in an adult-only environment, have child-proof packaging, have labeling, be able to recall products, have some regulation over ingredients, and have some public education opportunities. I'm sure there's a lot that you'd all, want to debate about here, but I point this out because this is not what we see for the hemp landscape. And so I think the hemp landscape is a wide open area where we have the potential to see a lot of unintended consequences. And the challenge of regulating hemp is that it's extremely scientific, and the policymakers tend to be non-scientists, and this is tough even for people that are well versed in science to understand. There's disagreement on how to define impairing or intoxicating. There's disagreement on how to define synthetic or semi-synthetic. There's disagreement about what to do about non-natural products that we're seeing, like THCO acetates. There's questions about what to do with full spectrum products. So these are products where they're literally taking an extract of the entire plant and putting it into a product. And that extract of the entire plant can have high levels of THC. So those are products that are, again, being sold in the grocery store. And there's a lot of debate about how to handle those in legislatures right now. And then what to do about biosynthetically derived cannabis that's being made from yeast or algae. There's some potential concerns with biosynthetic products. They don't always produce the exact version of the molecule. They might produce the mirror image of the molecule, and that can work differently in the body. A challenge for states is that often the regulators of hemp are it's a different agency than the regulators of cannabis. And I think these new molecules that are coming out and the lack of data and safety profiles makes policy making even more difficult. So the Cannabis Regulators Association put out a letter on hemp that we'll make sure you have access to. It describes the 3 loopholes that I talked about. And states came together to talk about what are those policy areas that are most essential to address when looking at either the Farm Bill revisions or new policies to address hemp-derived products. So we'll make sure you have access to that. We also put out 2 different fact sheets. There's a short and a long version of each. And the fact sheets are really focused on helping policymakers and community members understand what is hemp and where is it different than cannabis? What are the regulatory challenges, and where have regulators and communities seen issues as these products have come to market? So I'm going to close the door on hemp and quickly talk about interstate commerce and talk about equity, and then wrap it up. So topic number 3 is interstate commerce on the horizon. So right now, every single state for cannabis, not for hemp, but for cannabis, has a state-by-state system. And those cannabis products cannot be sold or trafficked between states. I think it's a bit of a moot point because we have hemp products, with interstate commerce. And I just showed you that the hemp products look very similar to the cannabis products. But increasingly, there are a lot of policy levers through which interstate commerce of cannabis could happen, and it's worth being aware of those. The congressional lever has always been out there. Congress could say, we want to have federal legalization of cannabis, or we want to allow for states to be able to trade cannabis state to state. That's certainly still on the table. Rescheduling is another way through which we could see interstate commerce. The Biden administration called on the FDA and federal agencies to conduct a rescheduling review to assess whether or not cannabis should still be a Schedule I substance. That review is underway right now. That review is based on the science. And in order to reschedule cannabis, that review would have to find legitimate medical use for cannabis, and would also have to find no or very low abuse potential to deschedule it. So I think it's very unlikely that that review will result in removing cannabis from the schedule. There's already enough scientific evidence that's been published that there is abuse liability for cannabis. And so that will not allow FDA to make a recommendation for descheduling. But I think it is possible that cannabis could be moved to Schedule II or Schedule III. That would mean that FDA finds some evidence of medical use, and there certainly is science to suggest some evidence of medical use, and that they recommend, based on that science, moving it to Schedule II or III. And I think we'd have to understand from them, what does that mean for state markets and for interstate commerce? There's also a number of states now that have passed legislation to allow for their state to opt in to interstate commerce as soon as it is legal, or even to push the boundaries on that a little bit. And opt in, when they think that it's low risk. So California, Oregon, and Washington are all states that have passed these policies to opt into interstate commerce. And California's policy is fairly broad. So their regulator just asked their attorney general's office to weigh in about whether or not it would be illegal for them to start interstate commerce, this year if they wanted to. So their attorneys general is asking the DOJ to weigh in on that. And we could end up seeing something like a Cole memo that would outline parameters in which interstate commerce would or would not be legal. I don't have a crystal ball, no idea what's going to happen there, but I think it's worth knowing about that pathway. And then the final pathway is the Dormant Commerce Clause. I'm not a legal scholar, but the Dormant Commerce Clause is basically a clause, a constitutional clause that suggests that no state can act in a way that precludes commerce from happening in other states. You cannot have this state protectionist approach when it comes to commerce. There have been a handful of cases that have come to courts about cannabis, mostly challenging residency requirements. A lot of states have said to operate in our market, you have to live in our state or you have to live in this area of our state. And courts have said those cases apply, the Dormant Commerce Clause applies in those cases, and that it is not legal for states to say you have to live in our state to operate in this market. So you could imagine a judicial pathway through which there would be enough of those cases that it would crack the egg open on interstate commerce, and we would have states with interstate commerce for cannabis. So I think it's important to be aware of the different pathways, and that it's not just Congress that might say this is legal nationally. There are these other legal, both in state and federal avenues through which it could happen. So there's some considerations to protect consumer health and safety in the case of interstate commerce. One is harmonization across states, and what happens if there isn't harmonization. States have all different policies now for packaging and labeling, for testing, for advertising. Some states have opted to have more restrictive markets than others. If there isn't harmony, it's hard to know exactly what happens there. And that brings me to my next one, the implications for public health and consumer safety. It's hard to know, would we end up with a race to the top or a race to the bottom? And I think a lot depends on which states are the ones with those policies. So if there's a state, say, that has really restrictive packaging, you have to have plain packaging for certain products, you can't use cartoons, is that state going to be a big enough market that everybody wanting to play in the interstate commerce reality will say, well, we're just going to plain package all our products because we want to get them into XYZ state, and it doesn't make sense to have different packaging for every state? Or is a really big, populated state going to have policies that are less restrictive and make, these interstate commerce entities say, we're not going to care about the state that asks for plain packaging. We're just not going to sell in that state. We're going to sell in all the states that, have more lenient regulations. I think that's a really big question that remains to be seen. I think there are also implications for small business and equity operated business and what happens in an interstate commerce reality there. For tobacco and alcohol, we see a handful of really big companies with a lot of corporate power. We are starting to see that for cannabis, but there are still a lot of small businesses that are local to the state that have sort of a craft business approach, and they're equity operated businesses as well. And it's hard to know how those businesses would survive or what would happen to them in an interstate commerce reality, which could really change the dynamic to have the cannabis industry become a couple of really powerful multinational companies. So that brings me to topic number 4. What have we learned about social justice and equity in cannabis? Where have policies moved here? We know that the war on drugs and the criminalization of cannabis has not happened equally across populations. As a public health PhD, I feel obligated to remind public health and prevention groups I talk with that the criminalization of cannabis that has resulted in the incarceration of individuals from particular communities like Black and Brown communities has had a public health impact. Anytime somebody is incarcerated, it has an impact not just on that own individual and their health and economic outcomes, it has an impact on their family and on their community. And so there are definitely some public health and prevention, there's a public health and prevention importance on thinking about how we remedy this. So this has happened in 3 different ways as policies have been implemented. One is a focus on equity in the marketplace. That policy, I think, is the one that regulators think the most about, because that has to do with licensing and who operates in the market, and basically trying to ensure that there is diversity in the market, that people that have been harmed by past criminalization of cannabis have an opportunity to get engaged in the market, and that the marketplace, to be blunt, is not just a bunch of white men, but it has representation across the communities that have been harmed. But I think for public health and prevention outcomes, while the marketplace is extremely important to focus on, the biggest benefits are going to come from expungement and record clearance and community reinvestment. Not everybody who has been in a community that has been harmed by the war on drugs wants to be in the cannabis industry. Expungement and record clearance has been a focus, I think, as states have realized that you can't have something that's legal and still have people that are locked up for having distributed or used, whatever it may be, that substance. We've learned a lot about what's needed there. Automatic expungement is very important. There's some states that have a petition process whereby people have to go through a legal process to clear their own record, and many individuals don't have the means to be able to do that. So there's been an increased focus on automatic expungement. The community reinvestment, I think, is where there's the most opportunity for overlap with disparities that have come about in health. That is the idea of community reinvestment, is states taking revenue from taxes from cannabis and reinvesting it in communities that have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs. In some examples, like in the case of the state of Illinois, they have a participatory based approach where the community is engaged in saying, these are the things that we need funding for. There's some states like California that have given a broad list. Substance use treatment, re-engagement, in society if you've been incarcerated, mental health treatment, housing, other sort of foundational issues that can relate to disparities, where they've said these are the kinds of things that we'll fund, and communities can decide on that. But I think there's a real opportunity for public health and prevention to get engaged in this, and to use data to share, where there may be particular disparities that have come from the targeting of certain communities, and to be able to use funds to help remedy that and repair the harms. So closing thoughts and summary, CANNRA exists to facilitate discussion among states about cannabis regulations, best practices, to identify differences across programs and really study and talk about those. Adult use cannabis policies are increasing across states. I think personally that cannabis is different from other substances and has some unique policy considerations. CANNRA has been extremely engaged and active in discussing issues related to consumer safety and public health, especially as policies change. I think the current US federal approach to hemp-derived products and these novel cannabinoids is the biggest threat we see to consumer safety and youth access right now. Interstate commerce is on the horizon. There are lots of different ways that it could happen. States need to consider what that means for their state and their community. And not have our heads in the sand and say this is 10 years out. This could happen in a much shorter time frame. Engagement from public health and prevention communities is really important for policy development and implementation. I work a lot with regulators. They want to hear from the public health and prevention community, and I have to be honest in saying they often don't. That's often not a voice that's in the room, or not a voice that's in the room in any sort of loud way. And I know that public health and prevention entities have a lot on their plates right now, but this is a critical time to be engaged in cannabis policy and to be engaged in a productive way. It's not particularly productive when a regulator is trying to implement policy that's been passed by the state legislature to go in and say, we never should have had that policy. At that point, the regulator can't do anything about it. They are charged with implementing what comes out of the state legislature. What is important and helpful to regulators, though, is to have public health there to say, if you're going to do this, this is the way to do this to minimize unintended harms, or to, help protect certain members of our community. And then lastly, more science is needed to inform policy and practice. We're living in a time where you can find a study to support whatever you want to say about the effects of cannabis, and that's dangerous. So I think we need to be really careful in the science that we look at. We need to look at reviews. We need to look at meta-analytic methods in studies so that we're not just taking one study and saying this is the reality. And then I think as policymakers and community members, we all need to do everything we can to encourage more science and to help support and participate in that. So that's it for me. So sorry for the interruptions. My family's been without COVID for 3 years, and it hit us just this morning, and I didn't want to cancel this talk. So appreciate you guys bearing with me as I've had sick members of the family come in. I can answer questions if there are any. Happy to have any dialogue or discussion as well.
Well, I know there will be questions, and thank you so much for sticking with us with everything you have going on at home. And that was such a beautiful presentation. I feel I can tell you, you definitely do not have COVID brain. At least we know that, because that was really.
I had a COVID member walk in, so who knows? You might have just seen my exposure, but anyway.
Could be. You're good at the moment, though. That was brilliant, and I learned a lot. That was really impressive. Thank you so much. One question that I have right off the top of the bat, and I hope that you folks will feel comfortable to unmute and ask your questions or raise your hand if you know how to use the raise hand function. But one question, have you taken a look at Canada and if we have any lessons learned from how things have gone there with federal legalization?
Yes, that's a great question. And we work very closely with Health Canada at CANNRA, and I've worked with them for a number of years. Because they have federal legalization, they are doing some amazing things in terms of data collection. And I think we will, as the years go on, we will learn a lot from Canada, because they have a nationwide survey about cannabis where they can really study how behaviors have changed as policy has rolled out. And that's something that we really need in this country. We are not collecting enough data on cannabis. Some states are trying to do what they can, but most of our data systems, as you all know, come federally, and the federal data systems have just not been modernized for this new policy reality. So I'm anxious to keep hearing from Canada what their data is showing. They have left a lot of authority to provinces. So while it is legal federally, provinces are the ones that have gotten to decide sort of how they want the marketplace to look. So there are provinces that have state-run stores. There are provinces that have a very commercial model. There are provinces that have restrictions on the types of products you can access. And there are provinces that are allowing, all of the types of products that we might see in the US market. I think it's too early to tell sort of where things are going. I suspect the folks from Health Canada would speak very cautiously as well. They're in the process of reviewing their statutes and conducting a really rigorous 1-year review of everything that's happened to make recommendations for whether or not there are areas where they might want to see tweaks to policy. So if I chat with you guys next year, I think I'll have a lot more to share than this year. But I really think their nationwide data collection is fantastic and is going to be useful to the whole world in terms of understanding how policy can impact behavior. They've also, though, had a really different reality from the beginning. They've had cannabis available through the mail, through their medical program for a number of years. And that is a way that people can access cannabis federally for them as well. So I think they have some different context that's important to consider too in the US. They're also geographically very different. So a lot of folks like to point to Quebec as an example of, a province that has basically banned all concentrate products, has really restrictive advertising and packaging and labeling approaches. But it's a huge province. So, I've been asked by folks, couldn't we do that with XYZ East Coast state? And my answer is, it remains to be seen, because you can drive to 3 other states in the same day that all have different policies. So I think we'll be able to learn from them, but we'll have to apply the US context to really understand what translates and what doesn't.
And kind of along that same vein, because of the caps and things, like, have you noticed in some states that imposing a cap on THC levels and things has driven the illicit market? Is that something that's been happening in your
Yeah,
experience?
I feel like I have a controversial perspective on caps for the public health community, but I was working on contract with CDC during the vaping lung injury outbreak and working very closely with states. And I think I think we definitely need policy approaches to address high concentration THC products. But I think caps are the wrong approach personally. This is my personal opinion, not a CANNRA opinion. Because as soon as you say only 60% or 70% of this product can be THC, what is the other 30%? You're basically saying you have to use additives, you have to use excipients, you have to use diluents. And because we don't have a safety profile on those, I worry that that is going to result in another unintended consequence and another vaping lung injury outbreak. So my personal perspective is that I would love to see states do more with serving size and package limits for concentrates. And we've shown that to be extremely successful with regard to edibles. In the early days in Colorado, there were no serving sizes or package limits on edibles, and there were overconsumption issues that were reported. They actually had 2 or 3 deaths that were linked back to overconsumption of edibles, where people had acute psychotic episodes and jumped off a building or, shot someone. I mean, very bad instances. And that is part of what led Colorado to say, hey, we got to rein this in. We need a 10 milligram serving size, 100 milligrams per package. We need people to know what they're consuming. So I think the same logic could be applied to concentrates. Now, the state of New Jersey has really done the most with concentrate policy. They have a special warning label that goes on all concentrates that warns against potential psychotic, schizophrenic outcomes. They have a serving size that's across the board. They've translated that to concentrate. So it's a 10 milligram serving size across the board. And there's a translation sort of equation that they've done for what does that look like for concentrates. And then they have chemotyping to help consumers understand the type of product they're purchasing. Is it low THC and high CBD, or high low, or medium? I think we need to study those policy approaches really carefully to see what they do for the landscape. But again, all of these discussions are happening in a vacuum in state legislatures and are not contending with hemp-derived products. And you can get a lot of THC from hemp-derived products. So I think for me, it's hard to watch this discussion happen over here for cannabis without the same discussion happening for hemp. Because if you don't have similar policy across both, you're going to leave a gap wherein you're not protecting the populations you want to.
Right. One of the advanced questions that came in was about opt-out policies for communities. Any thoughts about that, and if that you've seen that be effective?
Yeah, so I think a lot of communities that don't want to see cannabis in their community might opt out if they have that option. And I have questions again about the unintended consequences of that, because people can drive from community to community. Do we want them driving if they have, purchased or maybe consumed cannabis in another community? In communities that have opt-out, I don't think we have enough data for me to understand what's happened to the illicit market in those communities. And I wouldn't be in my position if I didn't fundamentally believe that a carefully regulated market is better for society than an illicit market. And I believe that. And I know not everybody in the public health and prevention space believes that, but I think anything that increases the illicit market is probably not good for consumer health and safety. So I think the opt-outs can be really problematic. And, I'd like to see communities have different tools to address the kind of market they want to have than having the only tool be, are you opting in or are you opting out? I think that's tough.
Right. Thank you for that. And so Dave Fialco, I'm calling on you. Dave is one of our favorite presenters on prevention topics, and he's very well versed in all this, but I would love for you to, is he still on? Where'd he go? Oh God, I don't see him.
He raised his
there you are.
hand.
I'm here.
Hey, that's why I don't see him. Hey, Dave.
I didn't. You can. Yeah. So you bring up the the illicit market and opting out and things. It's actually one of kind of I feel very that's an important feature to keep. And to offer communities. And just from my research, pretty much every state, I don't know of one that has not experienced this, that has legalized either for medicinal adult use consumption or both, have seen an increase or an illicit market thrive, and in some states an increase. I mean, New York City right now, in particular, it's about 85% of the dispensaries that you see active on the streets, which are in form of food trucks, are illicit, are illegal, and the police can't do anything about it. I mean, how are laws passed without any consideration for that, or any, and it's nothing new. It's in every state. Colorado, I'm an alma mater of Colorado State University, and in the last year, they've had several large illicit grow operations of several hundred plants in just Fort Collins.
Yeah, I think some of the illicit grows that are happening in the early states like Washington, Oregon, and Colorado are tied up in the hemp legalization. I know Oregon has had a lot of illicit grow activity, including human trafficking, and they've had to get federal agencies involved. And that has really been hiding in plain sight with hemp grows. So I think some of this ties back to hemp, but I also think there's a trajectory. So I always tell states that one of the most precarious times for public health and safety is right after legalization, before you have a market open. And New York's market is not, they have a handful of legal dispensaries that are open, but they've had more than a year now of having legal cannabis without a legal place for people to purchase it. And that environment, I think, tends to bolster the illicit market because people don't have the fear of being, criminally sanctioned for using cannabis. And if they want to use it, they're going to, try to get it because it's legal, but there's not a legal place for them to get it. So my home state of Washington, we're 10 years in. I think we have a fairly stable market. We've not had as many of the hemp problems as states like Oregon or California. The latest data from the International Cannabis Policy Study shows that it's about 85 or 87% legal purchases happening in the state. So I don't think we're ever going to completely get rid of the illicit market, but I think when states get up towards 85 or 90%, you've really minimized that illicit market and you've provided a legal environment that I think can have some benefits for protecting consumer health and safety and also protecting youth access. So Washington State has compliance checks. They've had, youth be part of those compliance checks to sort of secret shoppers. And they have extremely high compliance with adult only sales. And I think we see that in more mature markets. So it's tough on the East Coast. There are a lot of newer markets where I think you are seeing the illicit market have a bit of a boom. But my suspicion would be if they're able to open the regulated market and get regulated spaces where people can purchase cannabis, we will see those illicit operators decline. Now, a lot of that depends on what happens with hemp again. And I think as long as hemp is out there and unregulated, that invites illicit operators who can, hide in plain sight or hide under the guise of being involved in the hemp market. So it's a challenging reality now with lots of variables. And that's, I think, again, where we could look to Canada and sort of see what happens in Canada in the years to come. I think they have reported that their illicit market is declining. They have federal legalization, so they don't have the hemp problem. They've not drawn this arbitrary line in the sand around what is hemp and what is cannabis. But we have a lot to learn.
Yeah,
so
it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. And Canada, I think last I checked, had around like 50 million people living in the country, and we have like something like 340 million. So I don't know if we can really use Canada as a case study because the dynamics and the population layout is, two complete worlds apart. But this has been great information regardless. It's really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah. And I feel like I'm a broken record saying it all comes back to needing to look at the science and the data, and we don't have it all now. Like a lot of the questions that you guys are asking are great and important questions. And man, I wish I had data to say it's this, but the reality is we don't. And I think my concern, and part of why I got into the cannabis space 10 years ago, while I was working with CDC, was we need better data collection. Like we all need to do a better job of that. the sooner we have some answers, I think the easier it will be to understand what policy is best practice and, where we're seeing things that need to be tightened up or have unintended consequences.
So there was a question asked ahead of time that I think is a really good one. And I don't know if you have an answer for this, but looking at models of really good policies that, or even like on the hyper local level, right? So is there a template for like, wow, this is a great way to do this, whether it's a school or a municipality or other entities? Have you seen some good practices out there?
I'm always asked, like, what's your favorite state or what's the best state? And my answer is, I think each of them have done some things from a public health and consumer safety perspective that I think are great. And each of them have done some things that they would say we should have done it a different way. So I think we're still a little bit away from being able to say we have best practice. But I think we're getting there. One of the reasons I took this job with the Cannabis Regulators Association is I did want to work on fleshing out what are those best practices and what does good look like in a policy realm. And I think we have so many variables at play that it's going to take some more time to do that. It's also, unfortunately, not going to be as easy as a regulator saying, or as a group of regulators saying, we think this is the way to do it. So lab testing is a great example where I do think we're landing on some best practices. You need a reference lab, you need, standards across states, you need certain thresholds, you need, rigorous testing. You probably also need CGMP, but it's the state governments that are deciding a lot of those variables. And so it's not going to be able to be a group of regulators that say, great, we're all going to move this direction. They're all going to have to go to their states and say, this is what we think is best practice. Can we get there? And the state legislatures have all sorts of special interests in their ear as they would for any issue. So I'm sorry, you're literally seeing my 4-year-old with COVID. Yeah, I probably can't take many more questions. I apologize.
I'm sure that's okay. Did you have one you wanted to
just
ask?
a real quick, Gillian, if you can, you mentioned, and thank you so much for all that information. Oh my gosh, I feel like there was so much information. I wish I'm going to listen to it again and again, but maybe if you can you just explain again why limits on the amount of THC in products is not a good way to go?
Because, and I talked very closely to a lot of scientists during the vaping lung injury outbreak. The vaping lung injury outbreak was not caused by THC. That's not what was hanging out in the lungs. It was caused by the additives. And so as soon as you say you cannot have more than this proportion or this percent of THC in the product, you are saying 30% or 40% or 50% of this product has to be all these other additives because you have to have something to make 100%, right? And we are living in an era where we don't have FDA weighing in to say this is a safe additive to use or this is a safe diluent to use. So all of them have potential risks for creating another EVALI-like situation. So my personal perspective is that it would be safer to say you can have a product that's 99% THC, but you can only have this much of it, or it's only in this serving size, or you can only purchase one package, to try to do it that way. Because I think until we have much more information about the additives, it's just a huge risk. To aerosolize a molecule can change the way that molecule works and acts in the body. And we don't have good data on the kind of things that would be added to, say, a vape cartridge, or a concentrate product that's going to be dabbed or something. So it's a really tough policy area. There's the group that I'm affiliated with at the University of Washington, the Addictions, Drug and Alcohol Institute, put out a report that they were statutorily asked to put out by the Washington State Legislature to look at what are all of the different policy options that could be used to address high concentration THC products. And it's a fantastic report and has a lot of great ideas that we just haven't seen anybody propose. We keep seeing people propose the caps, and I think people are proposing that without thinking about what does that mean down the road. And I think there's a compendium of other policies that could probably have the same effect in reducing, potential use of these products or abuse of these products or access by kids that nobody's proposed, before the state legislature. So I think I'd like to challenge public health and prevention to get more creative on the policy realm, and also to think with a mind that's not just about the problem today, but what could we be introducing that could be a big problem tomorrow.
For sure. I see one more hand up. If you don't mind, go ahead. DCAROLAN, if you want to ask your question, then we're going to let Dr. Schauer go. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes, we hear you.
Great. So you mentioned the 2018 Farm Bill, it legalized all these hemp products. What confuses me somewhat is, so the feds legalized these hemp products, but then the FDA didn't move to regulate them or issue any guidance. Do you have any inkling as to why is there a delay? Do you have any idea what's going on there?
There's no delay. So the FDA legalized them and put USDA in charge of the hemp program, but USDA does not regulate manufactured finished products. They regulate agriculture. And so while the Farm Bill did sort of say FDA's purview stands as it would for any other substance, FDA feels like they didn't get the right authority or enough authority to be able to act on this in the way that they would need to. So FDA's actually released a letter last month, I believe, to say we need Congress to tell us that we have authority to act in this way. So that's been the hang up, is FDA's waiting on Congress to say you can regulate these.
Thank you for that. You are a star. I can't believe you're doing this. You're so great, and go take care of your family, and please stay healthy. All of you be well. Thank you everybody for joining us. This recording will be posted later this afternoon, but Dr. Schauer, amazing as always. And again, thank you for everybody for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.